Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to chapel and welcome as we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. weekend. We're celebrating his legacy, and this year is the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Civil Rights Act in the United States, which has been a big deal in creating all kinds of protections for a lot of people and women and voting rights, and we're pleased that we can celebrate his legacy here at Andrews University. There are going to be a number of events happening over the next couple of days, and we hope that you will join us for some of them. We'll be showing his I Have a Dream speech in the campus center all day Friday and as well on Monday. And on Sabbath, we will be featuring one of his sermons at the New Life Church. One of our students, Tyler Stewart, will be doing a presentation of one of Dr. King's speeches, Guidelines for a Constructive Church. So we hope that you can join us for those activities as we celebrate the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. Today we welcome Jonathan Duffy as our speaker. He is the president of ADRA, which is the Adventist Disaster Relief Agency. He is going to be talking with us about the work that ADRA does throughout the world and some of the things that we can do to be a part of that and how they have helped underprivileged people, providing all kinds of things for them. And so today we hope that you will listen attentively and see how you can participate. So please, Jonathan, come up. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I have a great passion for young people, and so it's an extra privilege to be here. But I just need to concentrate for a minute because I hit the wrong button. I want to start off perhaps by just sharing a few simple stories with you. I want to share some stories that give you a little bit of a picture of the need within the world. I haven't got the time within this presentation to actually give you the answers of what happened, but let me tell you the stories that I'm using are people who have benefited from ADRA, and if you want to know how we help these people, well, you'll have to ask me after chapel. But if you look at this first picture, this is a family who live in Mongolia. Unfortunately, the father contracted tuberculosis. He was unable to work, which meant they had no income, so they had to move out of their house. They eventually found an old wooden crate in the middle of nowhere, and they moved into that. It has holes. You're familiar with winter here, but maybe if you could double it, then you get a bit of an idea of the winter in Mongolia. If you spill water, it doesn't dry out till summer. It just stays as ice. And his family have no income. So in summer, they would try and till the land and maybe grow some food for themselves and a little extra for markets. But for most of the year, the ground is too hard. They couldn't till the land. So the mother would take the older children out, and up the back of where they lived, there was a railway line that went from the coal mines to the coast. And every day in minus 40 degrees, they would have to walk somewhere between 10 and 15 miles, walking beside the railway line, looking for pieces of coal that may have fallen off the train. If they could find enough coal to fill a bag about this size, then they would take it to market and they'd sell it for $1, and that was the entire income for that family. The next little picture here is of a Korean girl from Myanmar. Shortly after she was born, her mother passed away. She was the youngest of a large family. The father was looking after the whole family, but then when war broke out, the army would come and they would take all the children from the village. And so they would take the children who were old enough to hold a gun, they were conscripted into the army. The children who weren't old enough were made to walk in front of those who could hold a gun, so that if they stepped on a landmine, they didn't lose somebody who could hold a gun. So the father, on hearing this was coming to his village, sent the older children away. They fled over to the border of Thailand to refugee camps. Lele was too young at the time, so she grew up under the protection of her father. But one evening they were rushing back from a meeting in a nearby village. Before it got dark, because it was dangerous to be out at dark, it was on dusk, and her father stepped off the beaten track and stepped on a landmine and was blown up in front of her, leaving her with no body. The next picture here tells of, this is a young girl, an albino girl in Tanzania. Now, when she was born, her father rejected her. Without understanding genetics, he looked at her, he saw she was albino, he wasn't albino, he accused her mother of being unfaithful, and so he just walked out, leaving them in a state of poverty with no income. Her mother was determined that she would get a life and get a better life, and so when she became old enough, she sent her to school. In the first 2 days of school, about 2 or 3 days into school, like young little schoolgirls do sometimes, she's in the middle of class, asks to be excused, can I go to the bathroom? So when she headed off to the toilets, there were men that were waiting there to grab her. Because an albino is worth up to $70,000 to sell to the witch doctors, because they chop their bodies up and they make different potions for them that they sell. And so they're a hunted species within Tanzania, and this young girl had to flee for her life. What becomes of someone like that? The next picture that I have of there is this is a woman. This woman's from Malawi in Africa, and she lost her husband to HIV and AIDS. It came as a bit of a surprise because she'd been faithful, but obviously he hadn't. About 2 or 3 years after his death, she began to get sick. And so people in the village began to suspect that she had HIV and AIDS, and so they began to shun her, and she got thrown out of her village. She went along and got tested. She found that, in fact, her husband had infected her. She started on the retrovirals. She got healthy. She returned to her village. She volunteers for ADRA. She works as a voluntary testing person. She goes and encourages people to be tested. There's about a 17% to 25% infection of HIV in her region. She encourages them to be tested. If they are found to be positive, she encourages them to stay with her with the retroviral program, with getting their drugs. She encourages them to stay healthy and educates them. But she hasn't got an income. And so often her children can't go to school because they're embarrassed because their clothes are in tatters and the kids make fun of them. She has to walk 30 miles every month to the hospital to get her drugs and stay overnight and then walk 30 miles back. It would cost $1 to hire a bicycle to ride the distance, but she can't afford the dollar. The next story that we have here. So let's just look at this a little bit from home, because poverty and distress is not just something that's overseas. A typical story, boy meets girl, fall in love, they get married, they start a family, all is going well. Something goes wrong, whether it's maybe he loses his job or the children become more difficult to manage, whatever it is. And suddenly he exhibits this temper that she's never seen before. And the temper flares up into violence and he hits her. Well, this is the father of her children. She wants to hold the family unit together. She buries it and hides it and doesn't talk to anybody. The violence escalates. It becomes more difficult to hide. Perhaps the violence begins to spread out, and now the children are at risk. You want to run, but who can you go to? The next slide tells of a story of a young boy who, he lost his father when he was young. And eventually his mother remarried. It wasn't that his stepfather was abusive, but really he never dealt with the grief of losing his father. And so he didn't gel as well as he could have with the stepfather. He begins to act out his grief and his frustrations, begins to get into trouble at school. He's expelled from 3 different schools, so won't let him back into the education system. He begins to hang around on the streets and get in with gangs. He begins to become known amongst the police. What's the future for someone like this? And as we look at these stories, what I want to challenge you with is I want to ask you, what is our responsibility to this as Christians? How do we respond to these stories and the poverty and the distress that happens around about us within the very shadow of this steeple, of the loneliness that exists amongst some of the students here? What's our social responsibility that we have? If I was to ask you the question, why did Jesus come to this earth, then perhaps you might respond to me, well, that's obvious. He came to pay the penalty for our sins so that we might have life. But there was a second reason why Christ came to this earth as well. He came so that he might be able to demonstrate to us the love of the Father, that he might be able to give us a glimpse of what his greater kingdom is. It's often when someone makes their first presentation that you get an insight into what's their mission. I know that recently, 12 months ago, I was appointed as the president of ADRA. So you had to stand up and give your speech at ADRA Council. It's a time when you set the agenda of what do you want to accomplish under your leadership. And this opportunity came to Jesus. And one of the first speeches that he gave at the temple was found in Luke chapter 4, verses 17 to 19. And if we look at that there, then what we find is it says that the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." This was not the news that the Jewish leaders wanted. They wanted their leader to come and overthrow the Romans. They wanted their leader to elevate them to be the leaders of the world. They wanted the opportunity of wealth and of power. And here is the Messiah that they're waiting for. And what's he going to do? He's going to reach out to the lepers. He's going to reach out to the prostitutes. He's going to be present in the places where people are most broken. What about me and my power? Where's the elevation? Where's the benefit for me in this? And this wasn't a message which was well received. And yet, as we look at Jesus' ministry, it's interesting when John the Baptist, I love John the Baptist because here he is, he spent his whole life, preaching the news, preparing for Jesus' coming. Then Jesus arrives, he gets to baptize him, a light descends from heaven, a dove, he hears the voice of God. And yet only less than a year or two later, here he is in prison awaiting his execution, and he sends his disciples out and he wants reassurance that Jesus really is the Son of God. He only just heard the voice of God not that long ago. It makes him human to me. It gives me encouragement when I'm a doubter. So he sends his disciples out to find Jesus to say, "Send me back proof." And Jesus could have done anything. He could have said, "Here's a stone, take this stone, and when you give it to John, it will turn into a beautiful butterfly. It will give him courage. It will give him peace of mind to know that I am God." But what does he do? He says, "Hey, send back the message that you have seen me doing these things, that you've seen me preaching to the poor. You've seen me healing the sick. Look at what I have done. This is the proof of who I am." And what Jesus' vision was that as he left this earth, that his church, that his followers, that people profess to believing in him would continue his legacy of representing the love of God to a broken world and being a beacon of light and hope amongst all the brokenness. What score would you give our church? The church of Israel failed. Sadly, it failed, quite a deal in this. His desire was that people would look at his church and say, "Wow, if their God king is like these people, I can't wait to meet their king." And yet, they passed different laws. In Deuteronomy, there's a law that says there shall be no poor among you. But that was never lived out. The year of the Jubilee, from everybody that I've been able to talk to all of the various theologians, there is no record of the year of the Jubilee being enacted. It became a great philosophy, but it was never actually enacted. In Isaiah chapter 58, and this is a well-known section, but let me just read this to you. Just take me a minute to sort of get I'm trying to be electronic, and get better at these things. And so, we read here in Isaiah, it says, "Shout it aloud, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion, to the house of Jacob their sins. For day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near them. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting you do as you please, you exploit your workers. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen, only a day for a man to humble himself? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying on sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe him and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood, then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be at your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, "Here am I." If you do away with the yoke of oppression with a pointing finger and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness and your night will become like noonday. You see, what is critical of us is if we just profess it but we don't act it, then it means nothing. Is it good enough that we are a church of rituals, that, we collect a regular offering for the poor, that we, worship on Sabbath, and that we give up one day a week? Is that good enough if it doesn't impact how I live the other 6 days of the year? How does this challenge me as a person? What do I do about this? How do I respond to these global issues? What is my personal responsibility for this? If we look at the author, A.W. Tozer, he tells us these words. He says, "We hear a Christian assure someone that he will pray over his problems, knowing full well that he intends to use prayer as a substitute for service. It is much easier to pray that a poor friend's needs may be supplied than to supply them." Don't get me wrong, Adra loves prayer warriors. If you can pray for our ministry, then I am very grateful. But if praying for the Adra's ministry protects you from having to do something yourself to help a poor friend, then prayer is being abused. Prayer in itself is not sufficient. Tony Campolo, well-known youth speaker and author, penned these words. He said, "Faith without a commitment to justice for the poor is a sham because it ignores the most explicit of all the social concerns of Scripture." I don't know whether any of you have ever seen the Poverty and Justice Bible that's been printed by the Bible Society. It's nothing special, it's just a normal, regular version of the Bible. But in that Bible, they have printed it and highlighted every text that calls us as Christians to stand out and find a voice for the voiceless, to stand up for justice, to reach out to those in poverty and in need. There are 2,103 texts that call us to action. Yet how often do we hear a sermon preached on this? We have all these fundamental beliefs that are sometimes based on 6 to 12 texts. And yet where do we see this permeated within it? I'm not talking against the beliefs, I believe in them. But where do we see this action, which is central throughout Scripture, central to how we live our lives and impacting us, not just as individuals, but as a corporate church? Mike Yushenko, another well-known speaker and author, said these words, "If we are the body of Christ and Christ came not for the healthy but the sick, we need to be fully present in the places where people are most broken. And it has to do more than just has to be more than just a financial presence. That helps, of course, but too often money is insulation. It conveniently keeps us from ever having to come face to face with men or women whose lives are in tatters. When we're willing to get down to eating together, listening and telling the truth together, cleaning together, peeling potatoes together, the gospel comes alive." Each of us has a choice of how we live our lives, don't we? What do we desire for ourselves? What do we want out of life? What do we hope to accomplish? What's our mission? I'm not saying that we should give up everything and live a life of poverty to give to people in the poor. I think that's actually irresponsible. But I think that each of us has a choice in how we live our lives. And it's interesting because John Weidner was an Adventist who was living during the World War II. His father had actually been an Adventist pastor in Switzerland, and he was required to send his children to school 6 days a week on Sabbath, and he said, "My children won't go to school on Sabbath, they go to church." And so one day a week he stood up and he came to the authorities and he allowed himself to be incarcerated one day a week, jailed, to pay the penalty for his kids to be able to attend church. John Weidner grew up in this household with this example of if something is unjust, then you've got to stand up for it. Later on, his father was a chaplain and a teacher at Clonge College, and he spent his adolescence on that border of Switzerland and France. When World War II broke out, he was a very successful merchant. And he looked around, and when he saw the injustice, he said, "I can't stay quiet. I've got to do something." And he started the underground movement. And he's accredited. He's been given many awards by various governments, by Israel, by France, by England, by the US government, for the work that he did in helping people. His knowledge from Cologne College actually helped him to develop the route by which he saved these people. In his dying days, he penned these words. He said, during our lives, each of us faces a choice to think only about yourself, to get as much as you can for yourself, or to think about others, to serve, to be helpful to those who are in need. I believe it is very important to develop your brains, your knowledge, but it is more important to develop your heart, to have a heart open to the suffering of others. You know, there's a movement that is going around all of the Christian campuses around the world. It's called the Micah Challenge. How many of you are familiar with it? It's based on Micah chapter 6 and verse 8. And it reads here, "He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God." Act justly. You know, when you live your life in a way which is respectful for others. Lend your voice to people who don't have a voice. Lend your strength to people who are weak. Stand up for issues of justice. Treat others with mercy and walk humbly with your God. Act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. What I want to do is I want to finish with you with one challenge. And unfortunately, this is an anonymous challenge. I'd love to claim it as my own, but I can't. But I challenge myself with this all the time. And it says this: sometimes I would like to ask God why he allows poverty, suffering, and injustice when he could do something about it. So it's a reasonable question for me as the president of ADRA, isn't it? So you say, why don't you? Well, because I'm afraid he would ask me the same question.
Thank you so much. Do you believe a world without poverty is possible?
I believe it's possible. Do I think it's likely? Unfortunately, there is selfishness within the world. Mm-hmm. But do I think that people can live a life of justice and mercy? Yes, I do.
You do, okay. A lot of the questions that are coming in now are saying, what can we do? So what can we do here as students of Andrews University in our community? What can we do for ADRA, and what can we do worldwide for ADRA? So let's start with for ADRA. What could we as students do?
Okay. I actually have spent a day dealing with some students here, talking with students and faculty, and we're actually looking at building a relationship with Andrews where you can take many of your skills and help us to progress the work of ADRA through research, through us making available opportunities for you to be engaged with our projects. We're looking at trying to get together internship programs that would work for you. We're also looking at developing a program like a Peace Corps type program, if you like, where people can volunteer, for 3 months, 6 months, a year. You don't have to be development workers. We'll look for specific needs in areas of poverty where no matter what your expertise is, whether it happens to be engineering or accounting or anything else, nutrition, that you could contribute to an identified need within that area. So I'm bringing up a delegation from ADRA in April to meet with key students and faculty to look at how can we build this relationship stronger with ADRA.
So what can we do here in our local community? As one student has asked, how can we turn Andrews into a beacon of light in our community?
Well, I think that really it starts off with doing a good needs analysis. I believe that you can do some great things here, but I think that if you're going to do it in a planned and structured way. Talk to the welfare services in the local community, find out what is the need. Look at what you can do. Don't make it complicated so that you have to have, if you're not doing this particular course, you can't do it. But look at opportunities of what you could do through simple volunteerism to make a difference in the community. And I think you could choose 3 or 4 projects within this community that you could build a strong profile for this university in the community, that you are seen to be a resource of something that's giving, that's changing the community around about where you live.
And we can do this without money, because as college students, just time.
I worked with this with the churches in Australia, and I now have 1/3 of the churches in Australia who are actually running community programs, and it's not about money. We designed a simple intervention, and what I really asked of people was, can you give me 4 hours a month to help to make a difference in the community in which you live? It was about volunteerism, and a manageable amount of volunteerism, and I believe that we could set something else up here. There's a talent here to be able to do that.
Great. So you're from Australia.
I am.
And were you born and raised there?
I was.
Okay, we're loving the accent here, that's for sure. Well, we want to thank you so much for coming out to talk to us. We really appreciate it.